March 11, 1942. Corregidor Island, Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur walked to the dock at Corregidor in the darkness before dawn and stepped into PT-41, a small and vulnerable torpedo boat commanded by Lieutenant John Buckley, and felt something that he would never fully admit to feeling and that the subsequent decades of his career would be spent, in part, trying to address. He was leaving. The Philippines were falling. The 80,000 American and Filipino soldiers he had commanded on the Bataan Peninsula had been fighting since December 8, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor, against Japanese forces that outnumbered them, that controlled the air above them, and that were cutting off any possibility of resupply or reinforcement. They were running out of food and ammunition and medicine. They were dying of starvation and disease at rates that the military situation could not allow him to be seen to recognize as inevitable. The order to leave had come from President Roosevelt himself, relayed through Army Chief of Staff George Marshall. MacArthur was too valuable to lose and too important to the American war effort to be captured or killed in the Philippines. He was ordered to Australia, where he would take command of the Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific and organize the eventual counteroffensive. He was ordered to leave the men he commanded. The order was militarily sound. MacArthur knew it was militarily sound. He was also a man whose conception of military honor was specific and traditional and personal, and leaving his men in a position from which he understood they would not escape was something that the order could require him to do but could not require him to feel nothing about doing. The darkness of the PT boat departure from Corregidor was the darkness of a moment that MacArthur understood would define his reputation for the rest of his career, in the ways that acts of necessity that look like acts of abandonment always define the reputations of the men who perform them. He boarded the boat. He left. The men he left on Bataan and Corregidor surrendered in April and May 1942. The 76,000 survivors of the surrender began the Bataan Death March on April 9th. Thousands died on the march and in the prison camps that followed. The men who had been MacArthur's soldiers were prisoners of Japan for the next 3.5 years, and many of them would not survive to be liberated. MacArthur arrived in Australia on March 17, 1942, and at a railroad station in Adelaide he made a statement to the waiting press that captured everything about the man in a single sentence. "I came through and I shall return." The statement was characteristically MacArthur in its dramatic compression, the acknowledgement that he had gotten through his own crisis combined with the promise that he was going back. His public affairs staff had suggested that he say "we shall return," meaning the Allied forces, rather than "I shall return," meaning Douglas MacArthur personally. He refused the change. It would be "I shall return." He understood, with the instinct for theatre that was as natural to him as breathing, that the personal pronoun was the point. The men he had left in the Philippines needed to believe that the specific man who had commanded them, who knew their sacrifice and shared responsibility for their situation, was coming back for them. Not "we." I shall return. The promise became the most famous statement of Douglas MacArthur's career and one of the most famous promises in American military history. It was printed on millions of leaflets that were airdropped over the Philippines and distributed by Filipino resistance fighters throughout the occupation years, a promise that the Filipino people and the American prisoners of war who learned of it took seriously because they understood that MacArthur took it seriously. The campaign that MacArthur conducted from Australia toward the Philippines was the Southwest Pacific Campaign, and it was the context for the Operation Cartwheel Bypass of Rabaul that we have described elsewhere in this channel. MacArthur's strategic genius, whatever controversy surrounded his personality and his command decisions, was real and was demonstrated in the specific achievement of advancing from Australia to the Philippines in 2 years while preserving American lives through the bypass strategy rather than the frontal assault. The advance through New Guinea was the primary instrument of this campaign, a series of amphibious operations along the northern coast of New Guinea that leapfrogged Japanese positions, isolated Japanese garrisons, and brought MacArthur's forces progressively closer to the Philippines without fighting the mass battles that a frontal advance would have required. MacArthur commanded this advance with the specific qualities that his career had always demonstrated: an absolute confidence in his own operational vision, a talent for theatrical self-presentation that inspired the men he commanded and occasionally alienated the peers and superiors he worked alongside, and a genuine personal courage that the men who served under him consistently noted even when they questioned his other qualities. He was present at landings that were dangerous. He walked the frontline positions of his troops under fire in ways that made his staff permanently anxious and that produced the specific result that frontline soldiers respond to when commanders share their exposure, the knowledge that the general who was asking them to fight had chosen to be where they were fighting rather than where he was safe. The personal courage was genuine. So was the theatre. MacArthur understood that the theatre served the same purpose as the courage, communicating to the men he commanded that their sacrifice was witnessed and valued by the man who was asking for it. The return to the Philippines that his promise had specified came on October 20th, 1944, when American forces landed at Leyte Gulf in the central Philippines. MacArthur waded ashore through the surf in a scene that photographs captured, and that became one of the most famous images of the Pacific War, the general making good on his promise in the most literal and visible way possible. He had arranged it, of course. The landing craft that brought him to shore stopped short of the beach specifically so that he would wade through the surf rather than walk dry-shod to the Philippines. The photographs that captured him wading were the result of deliberate staging as much as tactical necessity. The staging did not make the return less real. He had promised to return. He had returned. The Filipino people who had been waiting 3 years for exactly this moment understood what they were seeing regardless of the theatrical elements that surrounded it. MacArthur's first radio broadcast from Philippine soil, delivered in the characteristic cadences of a man who understood himself as a participant in history and expressed himself accordingly, addressed the Filipino people directly. People of the Philippines, I have returned. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil. Rally to me. The specific phrase rally to me is pure MacArthur, the general assuming a role that in the American military tradition properly belongs to the commander-in-chief, addressing a people directly as if they were his subjects rather than an allied nation's citizens. It was presumptuous and it was effective, and it was exactly what MacArthur would say in exactly that moment. The liberation of the Philippines that followed the Leyte landings was the largest American military operation in the Pacific War by the measure of ground forces committed. MacArthur's campaign on Luzon involved hundreds of thousands of American soldiers and produced the liberation of Manila and the rescue of thousands of prisoners of war. The Bataan Death March survivors who were still alive when American forces reached their prison camps were the men that MacArthur's promise had specified he was coming back for, and the liberation of those camps was the personal fulfillment of what the promise had meant. The final act of MacArthur's Second World War career was the acceptance of Japan's formal surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945. The ceremony that MacArthur presided over was, like everything MacArthur did, theatrical in its construction and substantive in its meaning. He had insisted on specific elements of the ceremony that captured his understanding of what the moment represented. The representatives of all the Allied nations who had fought Japan were present. The ceremony was broadcast to the world. And when MacArthur spoke, he spoke not as a conqueror gloating over a defeated enemy, but as a man who understood that the moment required a statement about what the victory meant and what should follow from it. It is my earnest hope, MacArthur said, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past, a world founded upon faith and understanding, a world dedicated to the dignity of man and the fulfillment of his most cherished wish for freedom, tolerance, and justice. The words were prepared, and they were rhetorical, and they were exactly what MacArthur would say, and they captured, for all the theatrical artifice that surrounded them, something genuine about what the Second World War had been and what it was hoped the peace that followed would become. MacArthur went on to command the occupation of Japan, overseeing the transformation of a militarist empire into a constitutional democracy in a process that his biographers have described as among the most successful such transformations in the history of military occupation. He commanded United Nations forces in Korea from 1950 until President Truman relieved him in April 1951 for publicly disagreeing with the administration's policy on the scope of the Korean War. The relief produced the most dramatic confrontation between a president and a general in American history since Lincoln and McClellan, and it ended the same way, with the civilian authority affirming its supremacy over the military through the removal of the general who had questioned it. MacArthur returned to the United States for the first time in 14 years, to a reception that reflected how the American public felt about the general who had commanded their sons in the Pacific and Korea, ticker-tape parades in multiple cities, an address to a joint session of Congress that produced the most famous peroration in the history of American military speeches. Old soldiers never die, MacArthur told the Congress. They just fade away. He was right about that too. He faded away, spending his final years at the Waldorf Astoria in New York, writing his memoirs, receiving visitors, and dying in 1964 at the age of 84, never having faded as completely as the line suggested he intended to. Douglas MacArthur was not a simple man, and he was not an uncomplicated hero. He was vain and theatrical and self-aggrandizing and occasionally wrong in ways that cost American lives. He was also genuinely brilliant, genuinely courageous, genuinely committed to the men he commanded and to the specific promise he had made to return to them. He made the promise. He kept it. That is more than can be said of many men in positions of power, and it is the foundation on which MacArthur's reputation as a military commander ultimately rests, whatever the biographers and the historians and the men who served under him and resented his theatrical excesses might say. He said he would return to the Philippines. He returned. He said the Japanese would surrender. They surrendered. He said Japan could become a democracy. It became one. MacArthur was a man who made large promises and kept them, which in the profession of arms, where promises made to men in danger carry the specific weight of lives, is not a small thing. Old soldiers never die. MacArthur's promise didn't die either. I shall return. He returned. That was his whole career, in miniature. The promise and the return.